Hello and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, a podcast about football finance, governance and politics with me, Adrian Goldberg. I'm an investigative journalist, West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder as well, joined as usual by Charlie Methven. Charlie is Charlton Athletic's chief executive, a former director of Sunderland. He's given professional advice to Arsenal and Spurs. This week, we're going to be talking about the Lassana Diarra case and whether it spells the end of football's transfer system. But first, as usual, reflections on the weekend's football as well. And I mentioned that Charlie grew up supporting Oxford United. Charlie, your boyhood team broke my heart yesterday. The Baggies were coasting to a 1-0 victory until a last-minute equaliser by the mighty U's. But it is just worth reflecting what a fantastic journey Oxford have been on since you first, well, not since you first started following the club, but since you first got involved in helping to save the club, really.
Yes, that's right, Adrian. Obviously, I was a boyhood fan back in the days when the club was perennially in the top two divisions. After the death of Robert Maxwell in the early 1990s, it went into a fairly terminal tailspin, ended up in the conference, where a couple of friends of mine and their father took the club over, and gradually they, together with a group of other of us, started to rebuild the club back up, and it was fairly heartbreaking sort of work at times, thankless work at times. You were losing matches to clubs from towns you've never heard of, let alone clubs you've never heard of, the clubs from towns you've never heard of, and gradually clawing and the club clawing its way back up the leagues. And having served on the supporters trust, having served on the community trust, having, as you said, given board advice and rattled buckets in the bad times, and travelled the length and breadth of the country watching that team, even though now I'm not really in a position to enjoy it as much as I would like to be able to, because I'm working at another club and that's very absorbing. It's still very heartwarming and satisfying to see the Yellows back. I wouldn't say where they belong, because they've generally in their history bounced between the second and third division, but back in a sort of place where everyone can enjoy it, and where sort of being an Oxford supporter can finally be properly enjoyable after all these years. But I take no pleasure, of course, from ruining your weekend.
Liar.
But yes, and hopefully the Baggies will go on to have a successful season and finish in the top six, and hopefully the Yellows will have a nice, safe, secure first season back in the Championship without any relegation fears. That's what we're hoping for.
Yeah, and Charlton Athletic, a 1-1 draw against Stockport. I mean, not a bad result. Stockport are a good side this season, but a sense maybe that your season's still stuttering a little bit at the moment.
Yeah, well, we had a very poor patch where we lost 3 games, in a row, and not necessarily to top 6 sides either. And since then, we've beaten Birmingham and drawn with Stockport. And really, it was one of those draws where there was only one team possibly who could win it. And I think the Stockport manager said, we got out of jail there. And it was just one of those games that the second goal wouldn't quite come despite numerous near misses. But I think even so, the level of performance was much better. And it was really only marred by what looked like a nasty injury to one of our best players, the right back, Kane Ramsey, which is, we're still waiting to sort of hear the extent of, but we are sort of getting to that time of year. I don't know if the same's happened to the Baggies, but you're getting to that time of year when a few of the injuries do start to mount up.
Absolutely, and we wish him all the best, certainly. It's a very tough time for a footballer if they're injured and having to spend time out, never mind the physical recovery, psychologically, emotionally, and all that. I hope he gets well soon. Now, Charlie, let's talk about Lassana Diarra. He played for a lot of decent clubs in his career, didn't he? He played for Chelsea and Arsenal, Paris Saint-Germain. And the question has been posed in recent weeks about whether he is the new Jean-Marc Bosman. Bosman's case, people may remember, set a legal precedent whereby players who were out of contract could move for free. Now, There are suggestions that Diarra's case could mean the end of transfer fees altogether after he sued for damages after a contract dispute with Lokomotiv Moscow. He was blocked from moving elsewhere by FIFA until a fee was paid by another club. But the European Court of Justice said FIFA's rules were illegal. So the suggestion is that if a player is in contract and has a contract dispute, that he could move, and if FIFA's rules are illegal, that could mean that transfer fees cannot be imposed on the buying club. Is that about the size of it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what it looks like, Adrian. It's actually a fascinating case because you can sort of totally see it from a normal employment contractual situation. Let's say that you were, working at the BBC, and you were under contract there and you had a 6-month notice period, and maybe that 6-month notice period might add up to £50,000 or so. And you decided one day to walk out. And you walked out of the BBC and you walked down the road and you joined Sky News. And you started a new career there. Effectively, what would happen then is the BBC, if they were so minded, would sue you for breach of contract. And if you were found to be in breach of your contract, then you'd probably be liable for a penalty which amounted to the same sum as the 6 months of your contract, and maybe even for some damages in terms of any other kind of commercial and financial distress caused to the organisation. And that would be you that would be liable for that, for the amount that was deemed to be the breach of the contract. Now, in football's case, of course, that's not been the way in which things work. The way in which things work in football is footballers are held to their contract. They could, in theory, do what I just said, walk out of a club, and the club would then be able to sue them for breach of contract. In fact, when we were at Sunderland, we did that to a player. But the thing that has really stopped these scenarios from developing until now has been that if they then go on to join another club, then that club is also liable jointly with the player for damages. So that's meant that other clubs are not willing to sign a player who has walked out on his contract because it's the punishment involved. So FIFA then say that if a club does that, they will then be banned from signing any other players. And that's obviously a fairly significant punishment. So effectively, what this ruling seems to suggest is that whole sort of framework is under European law illegal. That you can't do that. It is simply a breach of contract between the player, who's an employee, and his former club, and it's got nothing to do with the new club. So let's just try and put some flesh on the bones of what this might actually look like. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Charlton Athletic has a player and he's being, let's say, paid a young player, promising young player on his way up, and aged 17, he's signed a 4-year contract with Charlton, his first big professional contract. And he's on, let's say, £4,000 or £5,000 a week. And it transpires during that contract, let's say 2 years in, that this player is a very good player. And it's reckoned that his transfer value might be, let's say, for the sake of argument, £5 million, right? What this seems to suggest is the player could walk out of his contract with Charlton Athletic, which at that point had 2 years to run at about £250,000 per year, and the player might be liable for the remainder of his contract, so £500,000. He might be liable to pay the club potentially, but the new club that he's walking into would not be liable to pay Charlton Athletic anything, and indeed would not be penalised for taking that player onto their books. So it doesn't take a genius to work out what might happen next, which is in a discussion between the new club and the agent of this player. The new club might very well say, well, if you lose that breach of contract case with Charlton Athletic, then we will make sure that you are made good financially for that. We'll put some bonus clauses into your contract, or we'll simply pay you much more, or whatever it might be. Because effectively, the buying club, even if they pay up the £500,000, which is the breach of contract amount, are effectively getting a £5 million player for £500,000 maximum. So this then eats away at the entire framework of the international transfer market. Now, I note that the two relevant parties have taken this decision in two quite different ways, and not unexpectedly, perhaps, but I think it foreshadows a battle ahead, let's say. FIFA have said, rather in the manner of the Premier League last week with Man City, but okay, it's no big deal. There are clearly a few things that need to be tweaked here. We'll get around the table with some of the relevant parties and let's have a look and see what goes on. And then FIFPro, which is the International Players Trade Union, which the PFA effectively is a subjunct of, have looked at it in quite a different way and gone, this is a seismic moment. This changes everything. This is a huge, rather like you were saying, Adrian, to do with like the Bosman ruling. This is going to change everything. This is going to, and they now clearly what the main party that FIFA are going to need to get round the table with is FIFPro. So you can see FIFPro sharpening their claws and getting their leverage position for that discussion with FIFA as to what the future looks like. And then it's not clear to what extent and how this is going to impact on the transfer rules within countries that are not subject to the European Court of Justice. This is not the European Court of Human Rights. It's the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, which the country with the biggest transfer market in the world, aka the UK and England, is not subject to the European Court of Justice. And therefore, if the football regulator, when it gets instituted in the very near future, decided actually that they were going to pursue a more traditional line on this type of stuff, then in England, at least, the rules could still apply, potentially. However, it doesn't take a genius to work out that potentially agents might use these rules, say, well, okay, they don't apply in England, but if I've got a player in England, then I can transfer him to a jurisdiction which is under EU law, so I can transfer him to a club in France, and then if need be, I can then transfer him back from the club in France to a club in England at a subsequent point. But the challenge here is to get my player out of his current contract that doesn't pay him enough. So it's not stretching it to say that this could have very profound implications.
Yeah, and in the age of multi-club ownership as well, that scenario in which a player is moved from an English club, which may not be subject to these provisions, could go to a related club within the EU and therefore free of the transfer fee, and then be transferred back miraculously back into England or into the UK. I just want to break some of this down, Charlie, because I think this is really fascinating. And one of the key takeouts from what you've said is that, from what the European Court of Justice has said, is that if in a case like Lassana Diarra, where he wasn't getting regular game time, he then had an issue with training, the club believed, and we're not taking any sides on this, but the club believed that he was effectively not training or not training properly in order to force a transfer. Diarra said, that's not true. I was genuinely unfit and could not train. But that dispute effectively stays as one between the player and the club. So that if Diarra decides to walk out and sign for a new club, it's on his existing club, in this case, Lokomotiv Moscow, to try and negotiate compensation with him. And the buying club can take him because he's walked out of his contract. So if the club that he plays for, Lokomotiv Moscow, have got an issue, which they clearly did, they can take that with him. They can take him to court if necessary. He may have to pay a sum of money. He may be even compensated for that by his new club. But FIFA's block on him moving and FIFA's until a transfer fee is paid by the new club, that's the bit that falls down, and that undermines the way in which the transfer market has traditionally moved, where unless a new club was willing to pay money for you, if you were under contract, you could not move.
That's exactly correct. Now, if you remember, the Bosman ruling removed the basis upon which a club could extract a transfer fee for a player who was out of contract. This starts to head towards preventing a club from extracting a transfer fee for a player who is in contract. That is the natural logic of where this is headed. Now, I think there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge on this one. This is going to take a little while, I think, to work out, and for various different parties to work out. As I said, this is a European Court of Justice ruling. Europe is not the only jurisdiction in the world. There are other relevant courts and relevant bodies that FIFA has under its or within its sort of, it's a global body with lots of different jurisdictions which it's involved with. So it's going to be interesting to see when it does sit down with different parties, who those different parties are, what their agendas are, and to see the initial positioning of FIFPro, to see whether they are willing to really go all out to try and make this stick, because obviously it would place immensely more power in the on the part of the player, right? A player who is effectively performing better than his contract would indicate, which is obviously totally normal. Players improve, generally speaking. I mean, if you think about what a contract of the player is, it's basically a trade-off between two sort of entities. The player says, I'm willing to play for that sum, for that length of time. I hope I'm going to improve during that time, in which case the club's got a good deal. But equally, if I got injured and the club still has to pay me, then the club's got a bad deal. So there's a sort of trade-off between these two things, or I lose form, or a new manager comes in who doesn't rate me, or whatever it might be. So it's a trade-off on risk and reward, with a sort of further trade-off being that the club clearly hopes, well, if you do improve and you do make yourself worthy of being paid more money elsewhere, or with us, or elsewhere, then we will then make a capital valuation increase. We will make money in the transfer market from having made the correct judgment that you are going to improve. And that's why clubs sign players on these long contracts, right? That's the reason. So it's going to be very interesting to see what sort of penalties you might build into the contract in terms of what damages might look like. Because obviously breach of contract is not just about how much money that player might have earned over the following year or two. It's also about, if he is found to be in breach of contract, it's then about, well, what damage did that do legally to that club, right? So if that club was able to say that by breaching his contract, that player led to that particular club not winning the league or getting relegated or whatever it might be, and was able to say that cost us £100 million, you are now liable. We are now going to take you to court to sue you for the £100 million of damages you have caused us by your breach of contract. So if I was FIFPro, I would be careful here. I would be a little bit wary of jumping up and down with too much delight, and perhaps not necessarily understanding the full implications of where this might lead. Yes, it is, I think you can see reasonably plainly, it is a win for player power, right? Definitely up to a point. The extent of that win and the implications of that win are yet to be seen. And as I said, just be a little bit careful what you wish for in terms of turning these things into conventional breach of contract situations.
Yeah, it can seem like a victory in the short term, can't it, for the player? But I just think of this from all sides of the conversation, Charlie. If you are, let's say, a club like Charlton or West Brom, you have an academy, and what you do with the academy is trying to bring players through to improve your team, but realistically as well, knowing that those players, if they're successful, will be sold on to bigger clubs who can give you a transfer fee that can then be reinvested in your academy and bringing forward more players. But increasingly as well, we've seen over recent years, bigger clubs have invested much more money in their academies, clubs like Manchester City and Chelsea, so that bringing players through who may not be quite good enough for them, but who they then can trade and who can then help them in terms of profit and sustainability, financial fair play, and so on. That's been a very important part of their business model. So you've got wealthy clubs and less wealthy clubs relying on the transfer market in order to succeed in their different ways. But you've then also got the players and players' income, which is obviously at the top level now. We're talking about astronomical wages. That's also underpinned by the existing transfer system. So if you can't trade players in the traditional way on the transfer market, FIFPro, the International Players Union, might be celebrating today, but they might not be celebrating in 5 to 10 years' time, because this could potentially have a massive deflationary effect on players' wages.
It's, as I said, it's extremely difficult to know where that's all going to go, Adrian. It's just really, really hard. And I think you're right to point to the danger of unintended consequences. What we have right now is a fairly finely balanced situation, which, since the Bosman ruling 30 years ago, has tilted obviously very heavily in favour of the players and away from the clubs. So the current system is fundamentally one which is in favour of the players. Now, could it be even more in favour of the players? How far in favour of the players might it become? Well, as I said, at that point, you do start to get into unintended consequences. You point to the academy situation quite correctly. The way the economics of an academy work, broadly speaking, is this. A club like West Brom or Charlton will spend around about £2 million a year on its academy, maybe a bit more. And obviously, partially, they're hoping that some of the players might come through and might play in the first team. And while they do play in the first team, they might be on relatively lower salaries than another player who you might trade in from the outside. But that difference alone will never justify spending £2 million a year plus on the academy. That's never going to be the case. The way in which the academy is funded effectively, or is hoped to be funded, is over a period of time, let's say 5 years. You look and say, well, if we were able to sell 5 or 6 players who were graduates of the academy during that time, then the £10 million that we have spent running the academy might be defrayed, or maybe even fully accounted for by the sale of players from that academy. Now, once there is no basis for being able to sell players who come from that academy, because they can simply walk out the door, go to another club, and then settle their breach of contract case with you, the actual grounds for then having an academy starts to fall away. And at that point, you have to ask, well, is that really in the interests of professional footballers and potential professional footballers to basically say to clubs, there is no reason for you to have an academy anymore? Because after all, without the academies, professional footballers to a significant degree wouldn't really exist. It wouldn't really happen if they didn't have the correct coaching, etc. Because you'd be in a situation where the clubs would say, well, we can just go and sign a player, a 23, 24-year-old player who's come from Africa, gone to France. We assign them into the club. There's no need to have an academy to do that. That's a much more straightforward thing. And you end up in a much more sort of what I call Wild West situation, where it's sort of each man for his own, dog eat dog, and players have to effectively find ways of coaching and training themselves to enable themselves to become professional footballers, because the transfer fee basis on which the professional club would previously have trained them has been cut away. So I think this point about unintended consequences is one that will be interesting to see play out. Prima facie, what we're looking at is a situation where that, it looks like it's in favour of the player in the first instance. But as I said, it'll be interesting once they've had proper advice how far FIFPro want to go in pushing it, number one. Number two, also be interesting to see how this starts to play out in countries that are not subject to European ECJ law.
Absolutely, but you're right. There's a kind of a delicate ecology of football here, and in the same way that on this podcast we generally argue quite passionately for the big money clubs to accept some sort of responsibility beyond their own self-interest, but for the broader interests for the game, you would hope that FIFPro would look at the broader interests of the game, because what may be a victory for one footballer at one moment in time might not necessarily be in the interests of football as a whole over a longer period. I just want to reflect on some of the history of this as well. Charlie, you're obviously far too young to remember, as indeed am I. But of course, there was an era when there was a maximum wage. I mean, it may be very difficult for younger people to imagine this. Even when I was a kid, I remember footballers talking about this. I think in the 60s, it was like £20 a week that footballers could earn. I think it was Jimmy Hill, one-time Match of the Day presenter, who led the PFA, the Players Union, in smashing the £20 a week ceiling. Brilliant. Totally supportive of that. And that then set in train a situation where there was at least a reasonable reward for footballers. But until Bosman, and that was in the mid-90s, 1995, the Bosman ruling, if players were out of contract, they still could not move without the say-so of the club that held their license or that held their registration, which again are totally supportive personally of Bosman winning that victory. The idea that your contract is finished, but your club or your FA might be able to say you can't move until a fee is paid. Ludicrous. You've done your time. You've honoured your contract. That should be the end of that. So the point at which we are now, it seems to me, is fair and reasonable. And I also think it's entirely fair and reasonable that as footballers generate the wealth of the game, there's more to it than that, I know, but as footballers generate the wealth of the game, that they should receive a fair reward from the wealth of the game. But this may just be a point too far.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, being somebody who is the chief executive of a football club and part owner of a football club, obviously you would expect me to be more on the side of the clubs retaining some power. And therefore, I'm sort of fully aware that I'm open to, special the charge of special pleading here. But I do think that's right. The point you made earlier on about it being a delicate ecology that currently is just about holding together, just about. And, really sports, this goes back to the point we were making about Man City the other day. For sporting competition to really work, the organisers of that sport do need to be able to really have a rule book and for that rule book to be, based on that delicate balancing of the whole ecosystem, and this increasing tendency of judges to get involved in sporting rule book situations, because that's what we're talking about here. Really, no one is actually saying that a player, even now under the current rules, no one is saying that a player cannot walk out of his contract. He can, and there will be a subsequent breach of contract case. What this is about is, can that player, before that breach of contract case has been settled, can he walk straight into another club and start playing for that club? That's the question, really. And that does start to get into that whole sporting rulebook situation. I don't think one has to have too vivid an imagination to sort of think about where this might go. For instance, let's say that there are two clubs, both of them are contesting promotion from the Championship to the Premier League, with all of the hundreds of millions of pounds worth of implications. And one of those clubs has a star striker. The other one has a less good striker, or a striker who's injured, struggling to score. They're struggling to score goals. And the player decides to walk out of Club A and then walk into Club B the following week and start scoring goals for them. That, in theory, under this ruling, that would be allowable. There would then be a breach of contract case between Club A and the player, but Club B, who would then benefit from the promotion that followed the striker going and scoring goals for them, would not be affected by this entire situation. So this is, as I said, this has very profound implications. It's a big deal. And we're going to have to find out in coming weeks, months, and maybe even years exactly what it means. But like you, in terms of instinctive sense of fairness, what Jimmy Hill and Bosman fought for was basically the ability to be treated like half decent, normal human beings, effectively. The idea that you could be kept with an employer even after that employer was continuing to pay you was just utterly extraordinary. And the maximum wage is less extraordinary. It happens effectively in American sports to a degree as well. But nonetheless, it is quite clearly a restraint of trade. There's no two ways about that. This, on the other hand, is basically green lighting illegal behavior. And that is a rather different thing, I think.
Illegal behavior, what, in the sense of tapping people up whilst they're under contract?
Well, just players breaching contract, which is illegal. And knowing that, unlike in normal employment situations, the amount of money that they might be liable for in that breach of contract is more than coverable by a future employer, or effectively the player himself using funds provided by a future employer. So I just think that that's not necessarily as instinctively a case of settling something that's currently unfair. right?
Yes.
Why should a player just simply be able to walk out on his contract without having established that the club has been in breach of something? Because don't forget that even now, it's very straightforward for a player to walk out because the club has breached its contract. And that happens. I mean, that happens fairly regularly. You'll see it happens less in the UK, less in England, but it does happen on the continent where some of the sort of financial sustainability rules are a bit looser. You'll quite regularly see that a club has stopped paying its players for a couple of weeks, and two or three of the players walk out. It happens regularly. So
Yeah.
that's already in place. That clubs abusing their side of the contract is already allowed for under the current situations. I'm not quite sure what this is helping, what this ruling is helping. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. And one final thought. I did say I believe footballers, like any worker, should be able to share in the profits that they help generate. And clearly, star players do drive big profits at football clubs. But there's also an argument here for due humility for any footballer, the greatest footballer. A, they're in a team game. And B, notwithstanding the rise of star players globally and individual merchandising, particularly with the YouTube generation and so on, I would argue that it is the brand of the club which is stronger than the brand of the player. And that when players move on, if Rashford leaves Manchester United, when Van Dijk leaves Liverpool, Manchester United will still be a great club. Liverpool will still be a great club. It's the generations, the history, as well as the individual players who create the brand from which they, as individuals, profit.
I wholly agree. And I think that's almost inarguable. However, in the real world, this isn't about humility or arrogance. This is about financial exploitation of a situation. And just like when there was the maximum wage, that was the club exploiting what was then the law and the rules to the club's benefit. If FIFPro, the PFA, and players decide to keep pursuing these types of situations through and are allowed to do so, it's nothing more and nothing less than them simply saying, well, these are the rules, these are the laws, and I'm going to do whatever I can for my situation under the rules and the laws. So I think we're long past the idea of thinking that within football, any particular party is liable to act in a sort of unself-interested way. Wouldn't it be wonderful if it all were that way? But it just isn't, and that's a fact. And I think if you're a player, you'd say, yeah, well, look, if you sign me for a 3-year contract, and after year 2 of that contract, I get a bad injury whilst performing service for you. This was not something I was doing in my spare time. This is whilst I was in the course of my duties for you. I got an injury that I could potentially be suffering pain from for the rest of my life. And yet, a year later, at the end of my contract, you say, well, yeah, on your bike, mate. There's nothing more for you here, and I'm turfed out to pasture. So I think I'd rather not look at this in a sentimental way and instead think of this as a delicate ecosystem, as you put it earlier on, where the law of unintended consequences could have ramifications that are not maybe quite as straightforward as the players' trade unions might think from the start.
Great to speak to you, Charlie, as always. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to talk about football and YouTube next week. And I know our last episode about Manchester City did very well on YouTube. And if you're watching this episode on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. If you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify or on another podcasting platform, please subscribe there as well and leave us a positive review if you're minded to do so too. And I should thank Mark Machado at 1129 for his brilliant work on our visuals and on our socials, and also to Jed Thomas, who helps to produce these episodes as well. We'll be back again next week. Good luck to Charlton in the meantime. Good luck to the Baggies in the meantime. Thanks very much indeed for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.